The Atlanta Braves signed shortstop Jorge Mateo for $1 million yesterday. But at the end of the day, I don't know if this really matters. Yes, welcome on into Braves Today, your daily source for news, notes, and updates on your Atlanta Braves. I'm your host, Lindsay Crosby, award-winning baseball writer and podcaster. You can follow me on social media at Crosby Baseball, and you can find all of my written work, bravestoday.com, because just like the podcast, the newsletter is also daily. We're proudly part of the Believe Podcast Network, presented to you by FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app or go to FanDuel.com to get started. Just a few minutes, I want to talk about Andruw Jones. Tonight is the Hall of Fame announcement. It is at 6 p.m. Eastern. We will find out if he and Carlos Beltran are joining Jeff Kent, who was voted in by the Contemporary Era Committee, as Hall of Famers. But before we do that, I want to talk about the addition of Jorge Mateo. On yesterday's show, which we recorded on Sunday afternoon, we discussed some of the options at shortstop, right? For signings, it was IKF, Isaiah Kiner-Falefa, or Jorge Mateo, and then we talked about a bunch of trade options. And between the time that we recorded the show and when it premiered, Atlanta went ahead and signed Jorge Mateo. I know that's not a great way to premiere a show, but I honestly don't know how much this is going to impact the 2026 Atlanta Braves. If you look at the way that things are expected to happen right now, Mauricio Dubon is expected to be your everyday starter at shortstop. I know that we've had a conversation in the past about how Dubon is a better hitter against lefties than righties in his career, right? Facing lefties, 283 average, facing righties, 246. From a WRC plus perspective, it's a 111 against lefties, a 74 against righties. And so the thought process was, if Ha-Seong Kim's your everyday starter at shortstop, you can build a pretty effective platoon in the outfield between Mauricio Dubon, who hits lefties, and Mike Yastrzemski, who hits righties. Well, Dubon is just going to have to play every day, right? You do have the ability, if you want to give him time off, you can throw Jorge Mateo into a game. But I do think it's very important to point out that in his career, Jorge Mateo has not been particularly good offensively, period. Like versus lefties, his career average, I believe I have this set for career. His career average is 239 versus righties, it's a 211. On a WRC plus perspective, it's a career 88 versus lefties and a 67 versus righties. Jorge Mateo is not here to take a ton of at-bats for you. Jorge Mateo is here to be a utility bat now that Dubon's an everyday starter. He's here to play defense. He's here to pinch run. And you've got a lot of options as far as how you want to use Jorge Mateo, right? If you get into the late game, you have the ability to, for defense, put Mateo at short and send Dubon to replace somebody in the outfield or replace Ozzy at second or something like that. And I know that Mateo has played all three outfield positions and he's played second base, but defensively he is best at short. And so the best thing to do, the best way to handle that would be to put him in for short and move Dubon to the other position. You've got options like that. You could, if you have somebody pinch hit, Mateo could stay in and run, or could come in to run and then stay in and play defense for the rest of the game. You've got options, but Jorge Mateo is not going to be a guy who is going to be counted on as a platoon bat with Mauricio Dubon. As of right now, you just have to live with the fact that Mauricio Dubon has a weakness against right-handed pitching. And with the current construction of the roster, you have to do that. It's entirely possible, again, we've talked about this before, that you make some other ad, and then that person is somebody you're more comfortable using on the other handedness. Brendan Donovan, in his career, has hit 293 against righties with a 130 WRC plus. Now, defensively, he's not great. And, he can play shortstop. It's nothing spectacular. You probably would be doing that defensive replacement scenario where either you'd put Dubon in at short and you'd kick Donovan to second, or you would just go straight to Mateo at short and leave, and move Donovan to second late in the game. But the way the roster's currently constructed, Mauricio Dubon is going to be your starting shortstop for probably the first half of the season. And that's going to have to be fine. And honestly, I think it will be fine. I think at the end of the day, who plays shortstop for you doesn't really matter. Provided you have somebody who is not actively hurting you on defense. And you have somebody who is not a black hole offensively like Nick Allen was. And again, I love Nick Allen. I am not in any way, this is nothing personal against Nick Allen. I loved watching him play defense. It's no secret that offensively he was one of the worst hitters in baseball. 53 WRC plus. Provided you have somebody who's just even remotely average, or even close to average offensively, I don't think the shortstop matters. Because what has to happen in 2026 for Atlanta to get back to being a World Series contending team is not your shortstop has to have a 100 WRC plus. That would help. Don't get me wrong. That would be nice. Atlanta shortstops in the last 3 years have been terrible. No shortstop since Dansby Swanson has had 100 plate appearances and has been, or more, and has been worth even one WAR. Which is frustrating because in 2022, Atlanta shortstops led all of baseball in wins above average, which is how many wins above replacement they had more than other teams did. Dansby put up 5.5 baseball reference WAR in 2022. And from there, in the last 3 seasons, you've got a collective negative 3.4. So even if you get 0 from Dubon and Kim together, which the projections, the bat over on Fangraphs has them combining to put up 2 WAR next season. Yes, adding 2 WAR is great. Nick Allen was technically positive last year, but adding 2 WAR is great. But going from 0 WAR to 2 WAR at shortstop does not win you the division. It does not take you deep into the postseason or take you to the World Series. Getting guys like Matt Olson, Austin Riley, Ronald Acuña Jr., your aircraft carriers, getting them to produce the 6 WAR seasons, that's what takes you to the next level. That's what wins you a championship. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely want 2 or 3 WAR from shortstop. That kind of needs to be almost like a minimum here. But if your cutoff is 2 WAR, 137 hitters did that last year. Jeff McNeil had 2 WAR. Romy Gonzalez had 2 WAR. Heck, Ozzie Albies had 2.1 WAR last year. If 2 WAR is your baseline, that's not that significant. But if 6 WAR is what you're looking for, 11 players did that last year per Baseball Reference. One of them was Matt Olson. 9 different teams had guys put up 6 WAR. 5 of those 9 made the postseason. And so to do what we want Atlanta to do next year, which is get back to a winning record, contend for the division, make the postseason. I feel like that's reasonable. That's the low end of expectations, is like be contending in the division, make the postseason is kind of the floor of where you should be. You need Olson and Acuña and Riley. Acuña had 3 WAR in his 95 games, right? He was hurt. Obviously, he started the season late, but then he missed time with that calf injury later. He still hit 290 with a 935 OPS. So it was a 163 OPS plus. He had 21 home runs and 9 stolen bases in like 90 games. And this is after he came back from that injury and was not the same guy. He missed the middle of August. Like, he got hurt against Kansas City because he was trying to show off to his cousin. And when he came back in mid-August, he had a stretch where he hit 228 with a 678 OPS. And he just really kind of struggled for a good 3 or so weeks. And when he finally picked it back up at the very end of the year, it was almost a little too late. But if you kind of look from like the Washington series on, he ended up being much better. He hit 400 with a 1279 OPS across the final like 2 weeks of the season. You need that kind of Ronald. You need Ronald to be the MVP caliber Ronald. And in Venezuelan Winter League, he's looked really good. He's stolen a ton of bags. He's not been caught stealing. He's hit a couple home runs. He looked really good. Austin Riley did not look good last year, even before the injury. And the caveat here is he was playing injured. But that was bothering him. The abdominal thing was bothering him for like a month before he missed time. But he put up 1.3 WAR last year. He hit 260, which is nice. 737 OPS. Lowest full season OPS of his career was a 106 OPS plus. This is a guy who gave you a 135, a 140, and a 130 in 21, 22, and 23. He was down to a 106 last year. He hit 16 home runs, and he was on pace for like 22 or 23. And then Matt Olson. Matt Olson was the team's leader in WAR. Matt Olson was also the team's leader in home runs, and he hit exactly 29, which is almost half, barely half of what he hit in 2023 when he led all of baseball with 54. And so for the Braves to be those contenders we think they can be in 2026, yeah, you need a competent shortstop, but you need those 3 hitters to be pushing for 100 home runs and 280 RBI. If Ronald ends up batting second behind Profar, you may see something like that RBI total happen. They need to have a combined ISO of 200. They need to be hitting for power. Olson's got to find that power stroke. Riley has to be back to the old guy. Ronald needs to be the superstar that he's capable of being. And at the end of the day, it kind of doesn't matter what your shortstop does. Like, again, they can't be awful, right? You can't just play without one out there or have like Vaughn Grissom level defense. But at the end of the day, we're not going to turn and we're not going to point to your shortstop play and say, hey, that's why you didn't make the postseason. If we point at anything that's not injuries, feels like it's going to be injuries again. If we point at anything that's not injuries, we're going to point at Austin Riley. And we're going to point at Matt Olson. And we're going to point at Ronald Acuña Jr. and say that there was something that they didn't do is why Atlanta didn't make the postseason. It's not going to be shortstop. So yeah, you signed Jorge Mateo. Great. He may not even make it through spring training. We don't know. You may sign another guy in a week. You may make a trade. You may do something else. Again, provided you have the bodies who can play the position, who can handle the defense, and can hit 75% of MLB average. Again, Nick Allen last year was a 53 OPS plus. Provided you have that, that's enough to get by if Ronald's hitting, if Olson's hitting, if Riley's hitting, if Baldwin's having the breakout, the next step into stardom that we think he can do. If Jurickson Profar really is as good as we think he is, and has he looked later in the year after coming back from the suspension. If Yastrzemski ends up blending in. If Harris and Albies aren't, negatives and some of the worst qualified hitters in baseball. Those are the things that matter. Shortstop, you've got to do it. You've got to field one. They've got to be decent. But that's not going to make or break the 26 Atlanta Braves. The aircraft carriers are. In just a minute, let's talk about Andruw Jones. The results are released tonight, and he might get in. It looks possible, but there's a couple warning signs we have to be mindful of. We'll talk about that next, right here on Braves Today. Final segment of Braves Today, Lindsay Crosby. Let's talk about Andruw Jones, okay? It is very clear, obviously, he is one of the greatest defensive center fielders in history. I wrote a piece up last week over on Braves Today about Andruw Jones's Hall of Fame candidacy and about how the baseball case makes a ton of sense for Andruw Jones, right? Every outfielder who has more Gold Gloves than his 10 not only was put in the Hall of Fame, but they were first ballot Hall of Famers. Willie Mays has 12. Roberto Clemente has 12. First ballot Hall of Famers. Every other outfielder who has exactly 10 Gold Gloves, Ken Griffey Jr., Ichiro Suzuki, Al Kaline, all Hall of Famers on their first ballot. Every other player who has 10 or more Gold Gloves and 400 home runs is in the Hall of Fame. It's Griffey, it's Mays, and it's Mike Schmidt. And yes, every single one of those was first ballot. But Andruw Jones is on his 9th ballot this year. As of Monday night, the public Hall of Fame tracking project that's out there from Ryan Thibodeau has Andruw sitting at 83.3%. Reminder, you need a 75% vote total to get into the Hall of Fame. All of the public and anonymous votes that have been released, there's 210 total public ballots. He's gotten votes on 185 of those. We have just over half of all ballots have been publicly released by the voters already. 424 total ballots is what we're expecting. 210 are out again as of Monday night as I record this. But I know he's at 83.3% and the threshold is 75 and it feels like he's going to coast. The thing we have to be mindful of is more so than anybody else on the ballot almost, Andruw Jones has been hit by not getting votes from the people who refuse to release their ballots. The way that the MLB ballot works, or the Baseball Writers Association of America ballot works, is at the very bottom, you put your name and you sign, and there's a checkbox that says, do you want your ballot to be published 10 days after the results are announced? And for some reason, the people who say no, don't release my ballot, they are the ones who don't vote for Andruw Jones. Okay. The public totals last year versus the private totals last year. And I'm going to use private totals as anybody who didn't release their ballot. The private ballots were 26% less likely to vote for Andruw Jones than the public ballots were. Now, the good news is it feels like he should be safe if that happens again. Last year, he lost almost 7% of his vote total, and he was already tracking like just barely over the threshold on the public ballots. He lost 7% of his vote total when the private ballots came in. And again, they were 26% less likely to vote for him than others. And that was a much bigger drop than other people. Andy Pettitte had a 2.5% drop. Bobby Abreu had a 5.7% drop. Manny Ramirez had a 1.7% drop. Some guys got more votes when the private ones were announced. Francisco Rodriguez went up 5.4%. Jimmy Rollins went up 2%. Felix Hernandez dropped 4.9%. Torrey Hunter went up 1.8%. But Andruw went down 26%. And from what I can gather, from what I can understand, the reason for this is the character clause. To explain the character clause and everything, in the rules for voting, in the guidelines, The BBWAA voters are instructed to consider a player's, quote, record, playing ability, integrity, sportsmanship, character, and contribution to the team or teams on which the player played. And there's a couple different reasons why voters have invoked the character clause to not vote for guys. PEDs is the number one obvious reason. Barry Bonds, unfortunately, has the MLB record for home runs in a career, and he's not in the Hall of Fame because he's connected to the Balco scandal in the early 2000s. And while he's not known to have failed a drug test, he is widely considered to have used performance-enhancing substances, and therefore he doesn't get voted in. Alex Rodriguez has suffered a hit from that same thing. Gary Sheffield, Sammy Sosa, there are multiple players who are connected to the steroid era who have not gotten voted in. Cheating, that's been another thing. Pete Rose was banned from the game for life for betting on baseball while playing and while managing, and he was not eligible to be voted for the Hall of Fame. Andruw Jones, when he doesn't get a vote on a private ballot, and sometimes the public ones, some of these people have come out when they write their columns explaining why they voted the way they did. They've come out and they've explicitly said this. He's having the character clause applied against him for non-baseball transgressions. In December of 2012, he was arrested on a charge of battery after a physical altercation with his wife on Christmas morning. Per the ESPN story, he reportedly drug her down a staircase and grabbed her by the throat during a disagreement. Gwinnett County Police, their report said he was heavily intoxicated. He was eventually taken to the detention center. He was booked. He was released on bond. He was charged with domestic battery. He pled guilty. And there are some voters who have used that as a reason why he has failed that character clause part of Hall of Fame induction. There are people around Atlanta who will point out that Jones and his wife reconciled, they are still married, all of that, but there are some voters who just feel like that's not enough. And we're at the point where it looks like Andrew's going to make it in, even if that same 26% don't vote for him in the private ballots. Again, last year he lost about 7% of his vote total. But he was at like 73, 74%, and you need 75% to get elected. He ended up finishing at 66.2. This year he's at 83.3. If he loses that 7%, like he did last year, he'll finish just above 75%. So odds are Andruw Jones and Carlos Beltran will be in the Hall of Fame class. And it's really funny, by the way, that Carlos Beltran on his fourth ballot is coming in higher on a vote total on the public ballots than Andruw Jones is. Because and these are not equivalent scenarios. What Andruw did is significantly worse. Spousal violence is not anything to make jokes about. But there are some voters who have publicly said they are not voting for Andruw Jones under the character clause. But then they're not using that same character clause and the discussion about the integrity of the game to leave off Carlos Beltran, who was the only player named in the league's report on the Houston Astros sign stealing scandal. And again, I am not saying that is worse than spousal abuse. But what I'm saying is I find it odd that it's like Carlos Beltran was cheating and people would still vote for him for the Hall of Fame. Again, I'm not saying it's worse than what Andruw Jones did. I'm not going to say was accused of, because he pled guilty to this. And I'm not personally saying that I think that should disqualify him from the Hall of Fame. I'm saying that there are voters who feel that way. And there are voters who have voted that way. But I just find it odd that Carlos Beltran is not being cited more on the integrity of the game stuff just blows my mind. I don't really understand it. It's, in my mind, you could make the argument, and I don't think I'm doing this, but you could make the argument that somebody who used PEDs before the league was testing for PEDs, a lot of those guys have not gotten in. But then guys like Carlos Beltran, who knowingly and intentionally set up a sign-stealing scheme that was against league rules, and they knew it was against league rules, is still getting votes. I don't really understand the argument there. At the same time, he's also a longtime New York Mets outfielder. When I wrote the newsletter up last week, one of the voters who came out and is not voting for Jones, but is voting for Beltran and cited the character clause on Jones, is a guy who either does or used to cover the Mets. Maybe that's part of it. I don't know. It just seems odd to me that if you're going to, why are we not invoking the character clause for Beltran like they are for A-Rod, who tested positive for PEDs after testing was put in and after everybody knew that was wrong? Why is Beltran getting a pass? I don't understand. But either way, odds are tonight at 6 p.m. when MLB Network makes the announcement, both Carlos Beltran and Andruw Jones will be Hall of Famers. That induction would happen over the summer in Cooperstown. And if Jones makes it, think about all the different players and Braves from the 90s who would be in. Obviously, Bobby Cox is in, right? But Tom Glavine, Greg Maddux, John Smoltz, Chipper Jones, Fred McGriff, John Schuerholz, who, general manager and team president. You'd have a ton of Braves from the 90s in the Hall of Fame, which kind of makes it hurt even more. You only won one World Series. I know you played in 4, but you only won one of them. And it kind of hurts a little bit more that you could have had, what I just counted up, 6 players, a coach, and a GM, all in the Hall of Fame, and you still didn't win more than one. But either way, this has been Braves Today for Tuesday, January 20th. Do me a favor. If you're listening on audio, 5-star review would be fantastic. Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you know when we drop a new episode. We drop a short, hopefully not with terrible news like Ha-Seong Kim getting hurt. Hopefully the next short is good news like Andruw Jones is a Hall of Famer. That would be a great short to be able to drop later today. Until next time, this has been Braves Today.